PaperX has always been a huge fan favorite for their uniquely aggressive playstyle.
Their playstyle is so fast, it is impossible for me to get bored.
Their playstyle is not only fun to watch and play against, according to Tens, but they're also consistently competitive on the international stage, giving fans another good reason to cheer for them. However, their overall competitiveness has started to change in recent years. Last year, Gen G rose to become the best team in the Pacific region, while PaperX looked as if they were slowly falling further and further behind everyone else. This trend continued into this year, and after a crushing defeat to DFM in the lower bracket of Kickoff, this will be the very first time in BCT history, going all the way back to 2022, that this PaperX score has failed to make an international event. So what is really happening to W Gaming that's causing them not only to lose, but barely win a single round against DFM on Pearl? In this video, we're going to uncover the full truth behind PaperX's problems by looking thoroughly at their gameplay over all these years. We're going to understand what made PaperX good to begin with, how competitive Valorant has evolved over the last couple years, and finally, analyze all the pitfalls and weaknesses that have led PaperX to the state they're in now. What do they really need to fundamentally change to be able to catch up with modern day Valorant and once again compete on the world stage for a championship? Back in the day, PaperX were one of the very first teams to show us the full extent of how Valorant could be played. Their aggressive playstyle surprised a lot of teams at the time, especially those who were still following a playstyle which was fundamentally closer to Counter-Strike ideology. Even though old competitive Valorant was still much faster paced than it is today, nobody knew the full extent of how fast teams could really run it down. And PaperX showed us exactly that on both attack and defense. PaperX perfected this style enough to consistently get them deep into tournaments, but they would always eventually hit a wall when they met a team who knew how to play a slower style and avoid their crazy aggression. In all of their major tournament losses, we can see huge rounds that PaperX's playstyle is explicitly countered by these more methodical teams, and those games were always their most crushing defeats. They struggled with FPX in 2022, who had this type of methodical style, but also with EG during the 2023 Champs Final, who knew how to play this way as well. Since then, teams have only become even better at this style, and G2 completely picked PaperX apart during their Champs 2024 matchup with strategies that forced PaperX into those late round scenarios that they just aren't comfortable in. It's pretty obvious by now that slower playstyles can be PaperX's weakness, but the Valorant meta has naturally moved towards slower and slower rounds every single year. You can see that the average round time has been steadily increasing since 2022. Out of all teams in the world, PaperX are the most affected by this meta shift towards slower rounds, because PaperX's rounds are some of the fastest rounds in the world on both attack and defense. This plot compares each team's average round time during Champs in 2023. The average attack round length is on the x-axis and the average defense round length is on the y-axis. You can see that during this event, PaperX were one of the fastest teams in the world, taking an average of 79.1 seconds on attack and 82.3 seconds on defense. Evil Geniuses, who eventually beat PaperX in the grand final, had a much more balanced position on this graph, which indicates that they had a better balance of styles that they could play. When we look at Champs in 2024, the meta had slowed down even more by then, but the craziest part of all this is that PaperX started playing even faster than they did before. PaperX had the fastest attack by far at 78.1 seconds, and the fastest defense at 78.7 seconds on average. This put them way faster than any other team at the event, and you can see that the meta is clearly getting slower as all other teams moved away from the bottom left of the graph, except for PaperX, who were actively moving in the opposite direction. A super interesting thing to point out from these graphs is that EDG had the fastest defense in 2023 by far when they tied for 5th at the event. However, in 2024, EDG learned to slow that down significantly by more than 8 seconds, learning to play more retake scenarios and learning how to win through map control, rather than just forcing fights all the time. Just like when EG won in 2023, EDG won in 2024 with one of the most balanced average round times out of all teams at the tournament. A moderate round time indicates that you have better fundamentals on both sides of the equation, which seems to be common amongst the teams that end up winning it all. At this point, it's obvious that PaperX needs to adjust their style to be able to play slower, but just spending more time on attack or defense is meaningless unless you're actually using that time effectively. So let's try and really understand PaperX's gameplay patterns and break down the problems and how they view macro as a whole. We can start by looking at how they've historically run their attack sides, which is well known to be the side that they're more comfortable with. Attack allows you to dictate the pace of the game, which is perfect for their fast-paced playstyle, and they were one of the first teams in VCT that consistently picked to start the attacking side on many maps. PaperX have one main approach to playing attack, and this approach is centered around conditioning their opponents to be scared of their explosive sight hits and unbeatable team fighting. Over the years, people have called this the PaperX deathball, and it's exactly that because it's so frustrating to fight against. They're incredibly hard to break when they're pushing as a group, and this is the case no matter what sort of map position they're in. Against EG on Ascent in 2023, they started with all 5 players pushing B main for multiple rounds in a row. EG tried a lot of different things, like taking complete control of the opposite side of the map, running up the flank quickly, and fast rotations into sites. Even though EG definitely had certain macro advantages in these rounds, when PaperX are grouped together and playing aggressively, strategy doesn't seem to help you in those cases, and it's incredibly hard not to get caught defending sites. This is so frustrating as the defending team because you feel like you're tactically set up to succeed but just can't seem to stop them. And then, when you're sitting there contemplating about what to do and how to win that fight in B main, PaperX suddenly blast themselves through A and win another round. Their attack sides work solely off making their enemies fearful of their big team fights and hard executes, and after they've instilled that fear, they can really begin to chain rounds together quickly. You'd think that this style is super punishable because PaperX lack a lot of map control by playing this way. But there's a reason that PaperX don't care about map control at all, because their team pushes just break a lot of conventional setups and can make standard map theory obsolete. It's honestly ridiculous how often we see PaperX get away with hitting stacked sites just by being so good at fighting together. And this wasn't only when teams were worse. This is still a regular occurrence for them in 2025, even against top teams in the region like T1, and especially on maps like Fracture, which are exec heavy and very reliant on your team winning big fights. Now that there's pressure to lose to PaperX's deathball, teams tend to get sucked into this mentality of continuously fighting back and often end up playing on PaperX's terms. We'll see defenders start to over-rotate and stack sites off of any type of noise, and this allows PaperX to force themselves back through the weak side if they feel like a site is overstacked, even without any control of the opposite side. It's common sense when you see positions like this, where all 5 players are stuck in the same spot, to think you're pretty screwed. But PaperX have no issue with 5-man rotating to the other side of the map to deathball their way through anyway. PaperX rounds defy conventional Valorant tactics, and they've learned how to explicitly weaponize the fact that they play a wildly different pace and a wildly different style than everyone else. At this point, PaperX understands that every team they play against is already looking out for their fast playstyle, so they have learned to throw in a lot of variations at the start of rounds to try and confuse opponents. But this pressure is rarely used as anything except for a fake. The main goal is always to move back into a full site exec shortly afterwards. In this pistol against 100 Thieves on Sunset, you can see that PaperX begin with mid control, which results in an opening skirmish. They end up losing a player, but win mid control in response. But they're not playing for a lurker or looking for openings through mid at all. Everyone on PaperX just groups up together towards a main. Again, we can see that 100 Thieves has some sort of read on this, but like we've seen before, when PaperX is given enough space to take these fights as a team, it's hard to stop even if you have a good idea it's happening. Nowadays, it's more standard practice for PaperX to run these openings involving fake pressure because their reputation alone is enough for teams to watch for those fast and hard execs, so they need to do a little bit more to keep their hits unexpected, even though they end up grouping as 5 99% of the time anyway. Going back to their game against EG on Ascent, we can see them start round 5 with some A main control. As we know, this is just used as fake pressure to keep EG guessing, because shortly after, the entire team rotates through spawn back to B. Now we're just seeing another hard exec through B main with Harbor Ult, but what happens when you reject to fight the deathball altogether? EG couldn't beat the deathball, so another solution is for them to adjust their setup and try playing retake. Now we see PaperX expend all their good utility on a site that is completely clear, while EG take out the lurker who's expecting the market player to be focused on the execute. They can set up the 5v4 retake with Omen ult into B main, and you can see that PaperX have pretty weak positions and low utility to play out their post plant and finally lose their first round of the game. EG earned a bunch of rounds back this half by playing for retake, and showed that certain retake tactics can be a big counter to PaperX's playstyle for multiple reasons. An obvious one is the way that PaperX use their utility, which is closely related to the comps that they're playing. It's been said 1,000 times that PaperX needs to play better comps, but let me show you concrete examples of where this can make a massive difference and how the agent meta has also been evolving against PaperX in the last few years. Historically, PaperX has had one of the lowest play rates of Sova and Fade out of all VCT teams in the previous 2 years. When we look at the pick rates of Sova or Fade at Champs in 2023, PaperX didn't play a single map with either agent. A big reason for this is because Skye was strong at the time, so she could collect decent info while still being a very strong support tool for their aggressive playstyle. At the beginning of 2024, Skye was nerfed by removing rechargeable birds and weakening her dog's clearing capabilities. Both these changes directly affected her info gathering capabilities. By Champs in 2024, we saw a major shift towards Fade and Sova being played. PaperX obviously didn't have a big sample size of maps at this tournament, but even then, it really shows how insanely important Fade and Sova became by the end of 2024 compared to 2023. 4 teams in 2023 didn't play a single map with either agent, but by 2024, 5 teams, including the champions in EDG, did not play a single map without an info initiator, with the rest of the teams not too far behind. This was another massive meta shift that PaperX had to adapt to. Every other team was way ahead of PaperX in figuring out how this info utility should be used. A standard practice today involves using aggressive utility off of info utility, and here's a great example from G2 in their match against Sentinels. In this round on Fracture, G2 are moving into a B hit. Most of you would probably think hitting B just means you should immediately toss Taeho and Breach utility into heaven. But watch how G2 uses the Taeho drone to clear the site and scale up behind it, while Breach is just holding out his stun. Breach is waiting to see what info the drone gets them, and in fact, other than Brim Smokes, G2 uses no other utility until the drone finds something deep into heaven. Then, Breach uses an Aftershock to help keep control, and Raze finds a kill because of the deeper usage from the Boombot. Having good info in a comp means that you get to use all your other utility much more efficiently.
On through the choke point, it's a full line Armageddon, there's no chance. You're done so. You're done so.
Playing with Sova or Fade not only gives you better util to work with compared to a second duelist, it empowers all other important cooldowns in your comp to be saved for later or used more efficiently. Now let's go back and compare these examples to what we saw from PaperX against EG. With no info besides the KO knife in their comp, PaperX can't effectively deduce any enemy locations. This results in Harbor ulting a site with nobody on it and wasting all the other exec util they blew. They already don't have that much util to begin with because they're playing double duelist, but lacking that standard Sova info just leads to wasting even more. All these factors are why we saw PaperX start to play the more standard comps during the offseason and during kickoff this year. And while this might have helped with some of their post-plant problems, being able to fully utilize these new comps, given their playstyle, is an entirely different story. Out of the 7 maps they played this season, they played 3 with Sova or Fade, and not only did they lose on these maps, they looked pretty bad on most of them. Having the players learn new agents and change their tendencies is already hard, but there are fundamental problems with how they move and play the map that diminish the impact from these agents altogether. During kickoff, we saw them play this double initiator comp on Abyss, but we still saw them playing the map in the exact same way they always have, even though their comp has completely different tools than before. We saw numerous deathball attempts through B main over and over, not really caring how many DFM players are there, and once again relying on winning big team fights to win rounds. Their initiator utility is entirely used to support them fighting sites, and although this is still strong, what's the point of picking agents like Cypher or Sova if all you're trying to do is peek and fight? Abyss is such a large map that defenders have trouble covering all the holes and lurk opportunities, and that's why teams are playing these high info comps to begin with. You want strong info tools on the default to be able to challenge these holes and play for map control. Cypher is a really simple and good example of this because the cam on Abyss offers so much great info and empowers incredibly strong control on any part of the map you choose. Here are some examples from DRX, who are generally still looking for those big executes, but show a lot more variety in how they default with Cypher. Flashback uses a variety of default cams in mid to scare away walk down pushes and also to continually gather information on rotators that cross back and forth. Not only is he denying enemy control and collecting important information, you can see him pull the attention of rotators like a magnet, and anyone who crosses mid has to pay attention to him. He's safely applying this pressure on every single default, and then, as soon as you lower your guard, he finds a round-winning pick on a careless rotator. We also see a standard cam into A main for free contact control, and even simple cam uses like this can really make your sight hits that much stronger. The cam forces defenders to respond because it could mean the start of a contact play up A lurk, or just a default cam to apply pressure. You can see that Gen.G are playing to explicitly break it every single round now. Now let's see how PaperX uses Cypher on this map. We saw the cam placed multiple times to passively watch for the push from B main. Sometimes this was the main tool to watch flank because Cypher would join everyone else on site. In the rare round, we're gonna see Cypher start in some sort of lurk position split from his team, but he usually just joins the rest of his team to 5-man the sites before he's applied any real pressure. This is just one map where Cypher was underused by PRX, but because of how fast these rounds go, there are obviously countless missed opportunities on Sova and KO as well. Their attacker side variations this game included going B, but 5-man running back to A when they were hit by the KO knife, instantly pressuring mid, but actually sending 5 people through B main, or faking mid control with utility, but then instantly moving into a big exec on A. This pattern becomes really readable, and it doesn't take long for teams to realize that everything mid is just a fake. PaperX have no idea how to actually use mid as a real tool to win the map. They have no defaulting that sets themselves up to be flexible. They're always committed to one side or the other at the start of every round, and only rotate out when they know that all 5 players are stuck. Creating complex mid-rounds is a big strength of playing info initiators to begin with, and PaperX are completely ignoring that aspect of their gameplay. I truly believe that this is the meta which requires the best mid-routing out of all the metas we've seen before. This lack of map control is another reason why their post plans are one-dimensional. Without any default control, PaperX aren't set up to play flanks, scare away enemy flanks, or challenge the rotators coming in to play the retakes. They have no other choice but to constantly take gunfights, and that's why they'll always overheat and throw post plants, because they've already backed themselves into a corner with their map control. Teams who understand this can completely pick apart PaperX's attack sides, because a strong retaking team like G2 is never trying to fully fight PaperX back. Their only goal is to smother them in the corner that PaperX backs themselves into.
A lot of space here as well. Give away that information. They know exactly where something is. He's stunned up, gunned up. Leaf able for one. Keeping it competitive. G2 3 versus 2. Having to fight through the pit though could be the advantage they need. In goes the Thrash. And Mindfree can't quite dodge it. They know exactly where he is. The pressure is on Jing. He has to cover this man to keep the pit online, to keep the chances there for PaperX.
Lastly, I've been talking a lot about their attack side for most of this video, but their biggest problems on defense also stem from the exact same issues. Just like on attack, PaperX only know how to take big fights to win rounds, so for a long time, PaperX have run huge group pushes as soon as the barriers drop. They've perfected this to the point where you aren't even safe in your own spawn, but teams have also learned to counter these pushes. At first, teams would just hold, and this seemed to work okay, just like we saw FPX do in 2022. But PaperX also got better at these pushes and were able to punish teams who were spread too thin across the map. Instead of just holding PaperX, modern day teams know that they can probe for key info that signals where PaperX are making their big push, and then they can quickly push somewhere else, putting PaperX out of position and forcing them into retake scenarios. You might think I'm saying that PaperX needs to play less aggressively, but the problem isn't their aggressive nature, it's exactly how they're pulling it off. Take note that every single time PaperX are aggressive, they must be grouped as a deathball, and this fundamentally means they're leaving a lot of holes around the map for attackers to abuse. It's almost as if PaperX don't really know how to play together unless they're standing right next to each other, and this is exactly what we saw on their attack side as well. Ideal macro means that everybody on the map knows how to play off everyone else, regardless of where they are. Defense simply requires you to be more spread out than attack does. We can trace a lot of mistakes on defense back to this core issue of PaperX simply not knowing how to play as a team when they aren't grouped and fighting. Here are a couple really good examples from their match on Pearl against DFM. PaperX starts this round by challenging a main control. They're able to fend DFM off of it and secure an orb for Phoenix. Now, they give up a main control and fall back to site, and you can tell they're trying to figure out where to go next. Art is left open this entire time, but Phoenix decides to go to spawn to enter B-Link through the sewer. For a second, he's about to check Art, but then we see PaperX's tendency to force grouping, and he decides to join with his team at doors. PaperX definitely looked for fights this round, but they didn't take any map control. Think about that. They actually have less control of the map than they did before they took those fights and just created holes in their own setup, while DFM are able to stroll through Art onto A, barely using any util at all. The more you watch, the more you realize that PaperX simply has a very weak grasp of macro and deducing where enemies really are. This is probably one of the most fundamental skills on defense, but they try to get away without knowing just by creating the PaperX deathball. In this round, we're seeing 3 players work into a mid-round A push. DFM throws a flash to fake Art control, but the Killjoy turret hasn't shot yet, so it's clear they haven't entered the space. Jett still has not seen anything in B long, so that means DFM must either be right outside of mid or in A main where PaperX are about to push with their strong side. But instead of waiting for the A main push to gain some information, we see a panic smoke Art when the Killjoy turret is still up, and then Phoenix walks up close to double doors where there's still an alarm bot he could play off of. What's the point of playing Killjoy if none of her utility is going to be used? Phoenix dies with all his utility up and on the weakest part of the map, which enables DFM to continue onto B. I fully understand why he took this angle because it's so advantageous for defenders, especially if you have a stinger, but this is a perfect example of PaperX's overarching problems. They don't have a good understanding of macro, but will rely so heavily on their micro to try and get away with it, and at some point, you're just not gonna get away with it. The rest of this game featured multiple failed attempts at creating grouped fights, and in trying to do so, they constantly created massive holes in their setup without DFM having to really do anything. Here's another round where we see PaperX start with 3 in A main looking for a fight. Since they don't find it, they all rotate to B in hopes to find another fight. But they can't find another fight on B, so once again, they 3-man rotate back to A, and while they're doing all of this, DFM has taken free control of Art again. PaperX fought for A main and ran laps around the map, but somehow they ended up with less control than they originally had. And now, despite 3 players being grouped up on A, Jett has absolutely no info to know that this contact play is coming up B. This is exactly how bad macro affects micro, because even though something has one of the fastest reactions in the world, in this situation he's mentally convinced that DFM are taking A and is just not ready to win this fight. It's not that surprising that the first and only round that PaperX won this map is a round where PaperX committed to 5-man fighting towards one side of the map. While 2 players push up top mid, 3 players are set up on A to fight together, and all the micro in this fighting is so good. DFM decided to force themselves through, and PaperX finally guessed right and punished them for it. But defense is not about guessing, because you have to consistently make informed decisions. DFM evidently never made this mistake again, and they destroyed PaperX 13-1 on their own map pick. This is how the 2025 meta is just exposing PaperX's one-dimensional playstyle more than it ever has before. This is not specifically about team comps or agents anymore. The truth is, PaperX have gotten away with their crazy unorthodox style for so long that they're lacking a lot of fundamentals which are required to succeed in the current meta. It's only going to get worse if they don't learn now. But it's not going to be an easy road for them because they're behind a lot of teams in this aspect. The bright side is, if they're able to bring their fundamentals to a higher minimum standard, it makes their unorthodox aggression that much better. If they can manage to combine well-played macro rounds with their famous aggression, this is definitely a formula for success, and I can 100% see them winning a championship if they're able to pull it off. I personally hope we'll get to see a stronger and smarter PaperX sooner rather than later. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.